On. My lesson for this morning is titled Your Life is a Zigzag, and allow me to get a little bit personal right off the bat. So I hope you don't mind me sharing a little bit with you all. But for those that may know me or what's been going on in my life the past, 12 months-ish, life has definitely brought its challenges. And again, allow me to be a little bit personal with you all. The first thing is that I applied for two jobs or had two job applications that I honestly thought that I met the requirements for and would do a good job. And I was passed up for both of them. And, did I particularly want the jobs? No. But did I feel that I had done the work to deserve at least an offer or consideration for the job? Yeah, I guess so. And as much as it hurt me to admit that did I want the job? Not really, but yeah, it did hurt not getting offers on either of those. And also for those that may or not know my family situation, that there's been issues on that front as well. So life has had its challenges, and to say the least. And so when I was thinking about what to talk about for this morning's lesson, I thought, I was really struggling what to talk about. And I thought back to my first ever sermon, which I gave, which was in 2019, so a little while ago. And for those that have really good memories, it was titled Hills and Valleys. And it is a song, based on a song that is by a denominational Christian singer. But it's a song I still listen to today. And it was a lesson essentially on the highs and lows of life, which I guess in some ways is a reflection of what life is, all right? That we have highs and we have lows, we have hills and we have valleys. But actually, the more that I was thinking about that lesson, the more I realized that it doesn't really give us the whole idea about what life is like. And you'll see what I mean as I go through this lesson. But then I came across this article. And again, for those that have really good memories, my last lesson that I gave was something similar. And if you can see, let me use the pointer. This is called the Gospel Coalition. Again, a denominational non-Church of Christ website. I'm going to put that out there. They do have really interesting articles. And you can see this was only published about a month ago. And it was titled, Your Calling is a Zigzag. And really, this article was simply the writer's reflections on his own life, and had really nothing to do with, I guess, it wasn't really anything doctrinal, but he was really just simply reflecting on the struggles that he lived with. And I thought that, I guess in some ways, this kind of gave us a bit of a clearer understanding of what life is like, in the sense that, yes, life does have its ups and downs like this, but really, in some ways, life is this continued road or this continued zigzag, because, yeah, we have bends in the road, we have detours, we have roadblocks, but at the end of the day, the road keeps going, right? That, yeah, we have ups and downs, but really, life, no matter what happens, will continue along, and the path will continue to move along. Now, I have to apologize to my wife, because last night she asked me when I was doing this lesson, are you going to have any data? Are you going to have any stats? And I said no. And that wasn't a lie. At that point in time, I didn't have any stats. But lo and behold, as my research came along, the stats found me. And again, not going to spend too much time here. From my favorite site, Pew Research Center. Again, I didn't go looking for this. This came up as on my Google search as I was going along. And this is a study that they conducted, and you can see it's titled The Ideal Age for Major Life Events According to People in 18 Nations. Now, the preface to all of this is if you look at the 18 nations that they surveyed, a lot of these aren't necessarily reflective of society here in the Western modern society here in Australia, where we have I guess, greater proportion of countries from developing countries. So let's take all this with a pinch of salt. But I think it is interesting research to have a look at, which is, if you read the article or this picture on the left, the ideal ages for major life events according to people in 18 nations, and it says, across 18 countries, the average age that people say is best to, right? We have getting married, have your first child, buy a home, and retire. These ages that you can see are what people have in the survey that they said is their ideal age. And then if we look at the countries here on the right, we can see that in this kind of brown-green color, it says the youngest ideal age of the three events. So of the three events of getting married, have a first child, and buy a home, which is the one that should come first, right? This is what they agreed. And then this is the oldest age of the three events of the three that they surveyed. So we can see that, these are kind of like the life events, right, that we think about. And, if we think about the generic normal life that we live, or you were to picture, if you were to ask to draw these life events, right, you kind of have this nice, what we would think of as this nice linear progression where you're born, you go to school, you graduate, you maybe get a job or go to university, you meet someone, you get married, have a child, buy a home, have kids, retire, and that's your life, right? And that's how that nice picture of life might look like for some of us, but for a lot of us, that's not how life goes. And it goes to show that there are often these turns and twists and challenges that we face in our lives that don't fit this nice linear progression. Now, taking a quote from this article that I wrote, if you want to read along the screen, again, I'm just copying what the writer of this article said. If you want to follow along, it says, "We're all desperate to know we're walking in God's will and fulfilling our calling. Growing up, many of us inherited the false assumption that responsible folks know what they want to do, make a plan, and execute it. Certainty was a sign of maturity. The problem is, life isn't always that simple, is it? There's turbulence, soul-searching, setbacks, and mysterious doors that open at unpredictable times. Calling often feels like a riddle we can't solve, a puzzle with pieces that don't seem to fit." And I think if we were all to be honest with ourselves, I think very few of us would find that life fits that nice linear trajectory that the world or society likes to outline for us. So I'm going to talk about 5 different points today that refer to this idea. And the first point is that your calling is bigger than your assignment. Because yes, the name of this article is Your Calling is a Zigzag. But if you realize that the title of my sermon is Your Life is a Zigzag, because I think there is a distinction that we need to make. And the first thing is the assignments that we have are the things that we are dealing with in the moment. These are the things that we are facing in the now, right, in our lives at the moment. So for those that are in school, it is your assignments, your friends, your teachers. Those are the things that you're dealing with in the moment. For those of us that are working, it is your jobs, your bosses, your colleagues, your promotions. Those are the things that we're dealing with. And then for everyone else, right, and all the other aspects beyond those things, we have our hobbies, our family, our friends, etc., etc. These are the things that we are dealing with in the moment. And these are what we call, I would like to label as our assignments. These are the things in the now. And these are all part of the seasons of life, right? And these are all things that are constantly changing, right? Ecclesiastes chapter 3 talks about there is a time for everything, right? There is a season for this, there is a season for that. There are all these things that we face in life. And those things are constantly changing depending on the circumstances we're in, depending on where we are in our lives, depending on who we meet. Those are the assignments that are changing. But the difference that we have is our calling. And I don't think, I guess maybe I'll disagree a little bit with the writer here, is that the calling for us as Christians isn't the zigzag. The calling is always going to be the same. It is our lives that are changing, our lives that are zigzagging along the journey of life. And so for us as Christians, right, no matter the phase that we are in, our calling should be and should remain the same. If we turn to Matthew chapter 22, Matthew chapter 22, reading from verse 35. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Now notice here when Jesus gives this response to this lawyer, the person that is questioning Jesus, and he's asking Jesus, what is the great commandment in the law? Jesus says, you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? All of the other laws depend on these things. Jesus doesn't say that, when you have successes in your life, this is when you are to do that. Or when you have lows in life, you are to do that. Or when you have, when you're in school or when you're in work. There is no time frame that Jesus places on this. He just says that you are to do these things, and then the rest of the laws will fall into place on these things. These things are outside of the realm of time or the circumstances that we face. This is the calling, and this is the commandment that Jesus has given us to follow. And we also need to remember that whatever we do, no matter what aspect of life we are in, that we are all serving God, that God is the center of our lives, and it should be the foundational aspect of our worship and of the circumstances of life we are facing. If we go to Colossians chapter 3, reading from verse 23, whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. And again, whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord. Again, there is no time frame. There is no season of life. There is no circumstance placed on this commandment. It is no matter what we do, all our work in any circumstance that we find ourselves is to be for God, right? And that is ultimately the punchline of today's lesson. So we could end right there, right? We could end with this idea of we need to serve God no matter the circumstances we are in. But unfortunately, life isn't that simple. It doesn't fit that nice linear pathway for the majority of it. And the second point that I want to talk about is a reminder that God's detours are divine direction. Because we often think, right, that our life falls into this nice series of linear events, right? But when we face struggles, which we will face struggles, we will face hardships, roadblocks, challenges along the way, that often we see these as something that is stopping us from getting to our destination. We see this as a barrier. We see this as a problem that we need to overcome and we need to fix. And yes, for some of us and for some of those problems and issues that it is that, right? But God has told us, and God is in control of all things. And if we genuinely believe that, then the challenges that we face in life are actually God just moving us along in the direction that he wants us to follow. That is not just God placing these barriers in our lives for us to simply just hurdle over or overcome, which, yes, you could see it in that instance. But we also need to remember that God has specifically placed those roadblocks in our lives for particular reasons to direct us along the way. So if we see life as this zigzag path or as this road, that we might see it as this bend or as this turn that is, in our way, that's making the road a little bit longer or the journey a little bit longer that we need to go to. But we need to remember that God has placed that in our path, and God has placed us in that moment for us to navigate along that path to get to that destination. And this is something that can be hard for us to accept when God changes our directions, right? We might think that we're expecting life to move along like this. And so when God puts these roadblocks or these turns in our way, that can be hard for us to accept. If we turn to Proverbs chapter 16, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9, the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. And I think this is so apt. Again, you can see I put on my point here, it says that it can make it hard for us to accept when God changes our directions, in brackets, some more than others. And that is a 100% dig at myself, because for those that shockingly might know that I'm a little bit of a type A personality, which means that I like to plan, right? I like to have plans in place for what I want to do and where, my life direction leads. But again, life doesn't always fit into that nice mold. And so when it says here that the mind of man plans his way, that we often put in plans in place for what we like to do. We try and, plan for the future and have, safety nets in place. But what does it say? It says the Lord directs his steps, that ultimately God is in control and we can have all the plans that we want. But if that's not God's plan for us, then that's not what we are going to do. And it can be hard for us to accept that when God places these things along our way. And I think another thing that I want to stress is that being a Christian doesn't mean that we won't experience roadblocks, and doesn't mean that we won't face challenges, but it means that God will be with us through those challenges that we face. Isaiah 41 verse 10 is probably my favorite Bible verse, because I think it paints such a nice picture of what I'm trying to get across. Isaiah 41 verse 10 reads, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And I think that is such a nice image that we can think about with God. When we are fearful, when we are anxious in life, that God is holding us, God is holding our hand and guiding us through those difficult times. And the image here that is being portrayed isn't that God is going to carry you through all the challenges so you won't have to face any problems in life. It doesn't say that God's going to remove every roadblock in your life, but it does say that when you have these challenges, when these detours in life, when you are facing the struggles in life, that God will be with you and God will be holding your hand through those difficult times. And for us, we need to ask ourselves, is this something that we can place our trust? Can we place our trust in the plans that God has divinely crafted for us? Isaiah 55, it's probably a more well-known passage for a lot of us. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That we, again, think about, we focus so much of our time on the here and now, on the plans that we are trying to make, but we forget that God is above all of that. God knows way more, infinitely more than what we know, and God sees us from a bird's eye view when we are so focused on just what we can see in front of us. And our thoughts, our ways, the things that we don't even know, the ideas and understandings that we can't even comprehend, that we do not even know exist, are out there, are in control from God, and that God is above all of those things. And so when God places these plans for us, do we accept that these have been crafted by that same God that knows and is in control of all things? So yes, God's detours are divine direction. Why? Why would God do that? Because God wastes nothing. Point number 3 is that we often see these challenges as difficulties that we face, and we can let them get the better of us. We can let them, make us think that God isn't there or that life is too difficult. And yeah, for some of us, we are going to face really hard challenges in life. No one is out here saying these things are easy. But God doesn't waste these things. God doesn't use these things for no purpose, right? And as much as we try to, as much as we dislike them, as much as we try to resist, that these roadblocks, challenges, detours, setbacks are all for a purpose. If we turn to James chapter 1, James chapter 1, verse 12. It reads, "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him." And I love James and how he writes, because he's so matter of fact in this teachings, right? That when he writes about the Christian life, he doesn't beat around the bush. He's always very blunt in how he explains things. And he says here that blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. He doesn't say who, when life is easy, when life is good, when you have success in life, it's expected that there is going to be trials in life. It is expected that there is going to be hardships. For once he has been approved, once he has overcome, once he has faced and dealt with these challenges, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. So there's requirements here, isn't there? There are requirements of obedience. There are requirements of persistence. There is a requirement here to love God. But if we continue on with these, then we have the blessings, the crown of life from God that has been promised to us. If we can persevere and overcome these challenges, there is a reward waiting for us on the opposite side. And another thing that I was thinking about as I was preparing this lesson for this morning is that when we think about all the great men and women in the Bible, right? If we think of your favorite Bible character, the one that maybe you relate to the most, or you think about the most during difficult times, or the one that you maybe aspire or look up to, all of these people in the Bible had challenges in life and challenges that they faced. None of the characters or men and women in the Bible that we read about had a really smooth sailing life where they kind of just went along their journey and didn't face any hardships and just kind of went about and did what God wanted of them, and everything was all smooth sailing and everything was great. We don't read of any character like that. We can at least read of challenges that they faced. It doesn't mean that they were failures. It doesn't mean that the challenges that they had in front of them was God trying to stop them on their journey. It was the challenges that life had in store, that God had in store for them, so that they could grow and become stronger and overcome these challenges to be better servants for God. An example that I have here is in Psalm 105. Psalm 105, verses 17 and 18. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons. And again, this is just two verses that kind of talk a little bit about what happened in the life of Joseph. But he was a man that faced great difficulty and great trouble and persecution in his life. He was sold by his brothers as a slave and had to work his way up. And he wasn't just someone that God wrote about a smooth sailing life that he had. He faced immense difficulty and immense struggle in his life. But we can see that the Bible does talk about Joseph and his life in a couple of different ways. The first way that we can read is if we continue on in this passage in verse 19. Until the time that his word came to pass, the word of the Lord tested him. And I think this is such an interesting verse when describing the life of Joseph, because it says that until the time that his word came to pass, the word of the Lord tested him. That God planned to. God, in God's ultimate plan, in God's roadmap for him, God was testing him until a particular time. And sometimes we forget that in our lives, that when we go through difficulties in life, we forget that there is a end point, there is a season that is going to change, because sometimes we are just so focused on the here and now. We are so focused on the struggles that I'm facing, or the difficulties that I'm going through in life, or the things that I am dealing with in the moment. We forget that there is that season that is going to come, that there is a season that God has ordained for each and everything to happen in our lives, whether it is difficult, whether it is good, whether it's success, whether it's blessings, whether it's challenges, whether it's hardships, whatever it is, that there is a particular season and timing for that. If we turn to Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, really, this is Joseph from his perspective. Genesis 50, verse 20. As for you, this is Joseph talking to his brothers, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. And this is right at the last moments of Joseph in his life, but right as we get to the end of the book of Genesis, when Joseph is reflecting on his life and reflecting on the events that led him to this point, when he meets his brothers again, he says, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And when we think about the struggles we face in life, these are often the things that we could easily think that God has put this, like, why did God put this put me in this situation? Why am I struggling with this? Why am I faced with all of these difficulties? But it says God meant it for good. There is a purpose for why we have these things. And not only is God in control of the heavenly timing of life and in the seasons of life, but he means things to work together for good. And it's no surprise that that will lead us to Romans 8:28, right? That God causes all things to work together for those that love him, right? But that passage, I think, and when I was preparing this lesson, that passage came up over and over again as a verse to use. And yes, we can talk about Romans 8:28, absolutely. But the thing that I was focusing a lot on is when God says God causes all things to work together for good, the passage doesn't say God causes the successes, the blessings, the easy times in life. Those are the things that are going to work for us. But it's all things, and that includes the failures, the delays, disappointments, setbacks, challenges. That is part of the all things, right? And sometimes we use Romans 8:28 as a verse of reassurance and a verse of comfort. And yeah, it is. It is a verse that is meant to comfort us in difficult and trying times. But at the same time, the flip side, if we truly believe that God is in control of all things, and if we truly believe that God causes all things to work together for good, that includes the bad times, the difficult times, the struggles in life as well. But we need to frame our minds to recognize that it is not for nothing, that God wastes nothing, that God has a plan and a purpose. And I think one way that we can help us to focus on that is by not living by what you deserve. And I put this deserve in quotation marks because the article used that word deserve, but sometimes that what we deserve is a perception of what we think. Because often we are disappointed because we feel like we deserve something that we don't have, right? If I'm being perfectly honest about these, the job offers that I talked about at the beginning of this lesson, is that yeah, I honestly thought that I did deserve it based on my track record, experience, CV, etc., right? And we have that expectation that that belief that because I have done X, Y, Z, I deserve that this thing is rightfully mine, that this is something that I have earned, and we forget that there is that is really a perception, that it isn't something that you have necessarily worked for or deserved more so than someone else. That sometimes that disappointment stems from something called pride, that we think, I have done all of these things, I have worked for this, I have done all of these things, I deserve, this is rightfully mine, right? But it is not. That often, again, we need to remember that everything that we have has been given to us from God. If we turn to James chapter 4, verse 6, it reads, "But he gives a greater grace. Therefore," it says, "God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Do we think that, arrogantly, selfishly, that this is something that I have worked for, that it is mine, I deserve this thing? But it says, God doesn't like this. God gives grace to the humble. Do we have the humility to accept that sometimes it does not fit within God's timing, within God's plan, within God's purpose for us? And yeah, we can choose to complain. We can choose to whine about the circumstances that we are in, or even worse, maybe compare ourselves to what others have. Because again, if I'm being completely honest, if I look at the people that were offered these jobs, did I think that maybe I did more work than them, that I was a better, that I deserved it more than them? Yeah, probably. But we need to remember that this is only a perception that we have. And at the end of the day, it is only something that will affect us as individuals. If we turn to Philippians chapter 2, Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world." And I think that lights in the world is a very powerful phrase, that we are something that is different, that we are something that has light, something that is in a world of darkness, that this light is something that is so obvious, so clear, so vastly different from its surroundings, that is what God is calling us to be. That in the circumstances of these difficulties, yeah, we can moan, we can whine, we can complain, we can grumble, just like everyone else does, right? But we are to be lights in the world. We are something that has been called to be different, to live differently than everyone else. And because of this, we need to prove ourselves to be blameless and innocent, to be different and set apart and be set above what other people in the world are like. And instead, we need to remember that everything that we have is something that we have simply received from God. And that includes salvation, right? We are so focused on the here and now, what's happening today, what's happening tomorrow, what's happened in the past, that we forget that there is an eternal plan for us, that there is something that is going to, that when all of this, we all forget what's here, when we are all gone, that there is an eternity that is still awaiting for us. But all of those things are none of those things had things that we have done because we deserve, because we have rightfully earned these things, that everything that we have is something that we have received from God. If we turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. "For who regards you as superior? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did not receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it?" And these three questions, I think, are so profound. Because if we look at each of these, for who regards you as superior? Well, who made us think that we are more superior than someone else? Well, that's a perception that we have. That's a perception that I have. And the second question is, what do you have that you did not receive? Well, what do we have here on earth that hasn't been given to us? Well, nothing, right? Everything that we have has been ultimately given to us from God, whether that is, the physical blessings that we have, the spiritual things that we have from God. All of these things, if we're being honest, are from God. And the last one is, and if you did receive it, which we did, why do you boast as if you had not received it? Why do we act as if we have received these things, that we deserve these things, that we have, worked for these things? But again, ultimately, why are we boasting about these things when God has given us everything? And that includes salvation. If we turn to Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast." That We have been given salvation through God's grace, that through God's unmerited favor that we have, because God loves us so much, we have been given this free gift of salvation. Not because we've earned it, not because we deserve it, but because God loves us so richly. And this brings me to my final point before we kind of wrap up this morning's lesson, which is God's definition of success is faithfulness. And success for Christians in the world is very different than those of us that are of the world. How does the world define success? It defines it as money, riches, fame, power, belongings, things. But for us as Christians, our success is not tied to those things. It's not tied to the physical things. It's not tied to the things that are going to perish when we, in a few years' time. Is not tied to the things that are going to, disappear or not be here in 50 or 100 years from now. And when Paul reflects on his life and the things that he did in his life, he focuses not on his achievements, right? But he focuses on his faith. If we turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. It says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. And Paul could have used this as a time to list out his CV. Paul could have used this as a time to list out all of his experiences and all the work that he did for the church. He could have talked about how he traveled to all of these countries by boat or by foot or by animal and was stranded and was shipwrecked and all of the struggles that he had to face in life. And he said, he could have said, I did all of these things for God. What are you all doing? I've committed my entire life to God and committed my entire life to serving God. Why aren't you all doing the same? But he doesn't, right? He says, I fought the good fight, I finished the course, I've kept the faith. That the faithfulness that he had, he found as so important for his future, for his salvation, because he says, I've kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, and not only for him, but also at the end of this verse, to all who have loved his appearing. That if we, just like Paul, continue on in our faith in God, in our belief and understanding that God is bigger than all, that God is in control of all things, that God is beyond the struggles that we face in life, that we too can have this crown of righteousness. And going back to the idea of the men and women of faith that we, look at and that we can read about in the Bible, a lot of them never really saw necessarily what we would identify as success, right? If we think about, for example, Joseph didn't enter into the promised land. A lot of these characters in the Old Testament, if we read about in Genesis, Moses, Abraham, these men didn't enter into the promised land, right? They never saw the success, quote unquote, that God promised his people. When God said that, I'm going to give you this land, right? A lot of these characters didn't see it, and they didn't get to experience and enjoy that success. But that doesn't mean that they weren't remembered and they weren't honored for their faith and their obedience to God's commandments, right? When we think about, that famous, chapter of faith in Hebrews 11 that lists out a whole bunch of men and women that did great things for God and that were great servants of God and his will, that a lot of them, yes, they faced challenges and yes, they faced struggles and hardships, but they were all faithful to God. They were all faithful in what God had asked them to do and in their mission that God had given to them, despite the challenges and detours that they faced. And they are honored and remembered and immortalized in that passage and in their respective passages in the Bible because of their faith and their obedience that they had to God and his commandments. Because ultimately, we are not rewarded because of how successful we are, but because of how faithful we are. If we turn to Matthew chapter 25, Matthew chapter 25 from verses 20 to 23. This is talking about the parable of the talents. And in verse 20, the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Verse 22, also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. So when we look at these two men, the one who had 5 talents and the one that had 2 talents, what does the master say? The master doesn't say, well done because you doubled your investment. It doesn't say, well done because you've taken what I've asked of you and done what I've asked, which is true. That is what they did. But he is acknowledging that they were faithful and they were faithful to his message and to his commandment. And we can see, and again, we could talk about a lot about the parable of the talents and a lot of the lessons that we can draw from this. But ultimately, what I'm trying to get at is because they were rewarded because they were faithful, because they were faithful to their cause. It didn't matter that, the master could have said, well, he had 5 and he, gained 5 additional and you had 2. So why didn't you, work even harder to get that 5? If that's the standard, if we know that there is potential for even more growth, why didn't you put in more effort? You could have put in more effort and been more successful. But that's not what the master uses as the standard of measure for success. He uses the remark that he gives to each of them is that, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things, and that I'll put you in charge of many things, right? Enter into the joy of your master. That they were acknowledged as successful because they were faithful to God and to their master. And for us, that is God. And so, as we come to an end of this morning's lesson, I'm going to bring us back to the scripture reading for this morning, which is Psalm 46, verses 1-3. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. And honestly, if I think about the verses that on the screen that I chose for this lesson this morning, I think that, it's not really super applicable to what we've talked about, because yes, when we read a passage like this, we have great imagery of, the earth changing, the mountains moving into the sea waters and earthquakes, that it paints a very grand picture of what life is like. And for some of us, yes, that is what life may look like. But life doesn't always fit into a nice fit into an imagery that looks like this. Sometimes life is this winding road that we face. And yes, we can see life and the struggles that we face as immense challenges. But can we reframe our thinking to, instead of thinking that life and the challenges we face that looks like this, to think about it that God has actually placed us in the moment that we need to be right now. And the turns that we face in life are actually placed by God along the road for us along our journey. So as we draw ourselves, bring this lesson to a close, I've only got one more quote from the article that I mentioned right at the start of the lesson, which says, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, know that your calling is rarely a straight, predictable line. It is a zigzag. And again, whether, I think we should cross out that word calling and probably replace it with life, that life is a zigzag, that there are changes and turns along this path that we face, along this path that we call life, and along the lives that we are all experiencing in the now. And where we are in our lives is exactly where God wants to be. And as much as we try and fight it, as much as we try to, challenge ourselves or, resist what God has planned for us, that we need to remember that that is exactly where God wants us to be. That those challenges are in place so that we can grow, and that God doesn't waste anything. God uses these things for us and for a purpose. And no matter the twists and turns that we face, no matter what is in front of us, that we need to trust that God sees the whole path. That God, if you think about it, when you are on the road or when you are in your car, and we only see what's in front of us, right? We might see what's in front of us, we might see what's behind us. We don't see what's happening, kilometers down the line. We don't have a bird's eye view that God has. We don't see the whole picture, but we can trust, and we should trust, that God sees that whole path and God sees that whole journey for us, and that when God places these difficulties in our lives, that he places them for a reason. And my final remark is that, even though we face difficulties and we face challenges in life, we need to remember that That's not the end, that is just the season of now, that there are seasons that are going to change and that life is going to change. And we also need to remember that sometimes God can bless us even more than we even thought possible, that when we face these struggles in life, that they are there for a purpose, but the blessings that God can give us could be even greater than what we think possible. And I've got a picture to end our lesson this morning. So for all of us here, when we think about our plans moving forward, when we think about our journey in life, let us remember that there is a season for everything. There is a time and there is a place for everything. So if you would like to learn more about what it means to be a Christian and learn more about what God's blessings are, please make that request known as we stand and sing our final hymn.
Thanks for